Good evening to all the participants who have joined this session. Uh, for those of you who are new here, this is a faculty endowment lecture organized by the Department of English, Sri Krishna Aditya College of Arts and Science. And we are currently at the eighth session of this faculty endowment lecture. And today's lecture is the continuation of the past weeks, and it is on pioneers of English criticism shaping the landscape of literary discourse. And today's session will be handled by Mr. A. John Paul Bhupati, Assistant Professor, Department of English in Sri Krishna Aditya College of Arts and Science. John Paul sir has also taken the previous sessions, and with the continuation of this of his lecture series, today is the fourth lecture series, and today he'll be dealing with one of the foremost literary figures, Mr. John Dryden. And John sir, I think you can start, sir.
So thank you, sir. So good evening, all. So I welcome you all for this um, eighth session of Faculty Endowment Lecture. So in our previous sessions, uh, we had a literary journey by delving into the insights of Philip Sidney and Ben Jonson, the two great literary giants whose critical works laid the foundation for the informed literary discourse. In continuation, we'll continue our exploration by turning our attention to other two equally remarkable figures, John Dryden and Joseph Addison. Actually, I thought of completing John Dryden, Addison, and Pope, as well as Dr. Johnson, but I think that cannot be a justifiable fact um, if I don't dedicate enough time for these great literary legends. So, Dryden, who was a towering figure of the 17th century, was rightly called as the father of English criticism by Dr. Johnson. Uh, he had a vast literary output in his contribution. We can see poetry, plays, critical essays, epistles, prefaces, prefaces to the translations, and he had been a leading voice in the intellectual landscape of his contemporary. His an essay of dramatic poesy, which still remains a landmark in critical thought, and that makes us engaging in debate on merits of classical and modern drama. On the other side, Joseph Addison, who was also a prominent writer and importantly essayist of the next century, 18th century, and he further enriched the landscape of English criticism. Uh, most of the all of the uh, literary contributions, which still being highly influential till this time, were all in a periodical called The Spectator. So Addison brought the literary analysis to a broader audience, and his essays are insightful. They encompass a range of genres and topics in maybe like from aesthetics to morality, and he brought the philosophical insights of literary criticism from the libraries or from the elite sect to the common table. So now in today's lecture we'll encounter the unique perspectives on the various facets of literature, uh, from the essential elements of uh, all forms of art to the power of language to evoke emotions, and the critical discourse or the critical contribution of these two writers, we'll try to understand their these understand these two writers' literary values and beliefs, and what kind of valuable insights they have given to the evolution of English literature itself. John Dryden was a greatest literary figure in the 17th century. When we talk about 17th century, it was an age of higher standards. French was the masters in drama, in creating any new patterns in poetry as well as drama, and England was in much uh, backward in comparison to French scholars, and French became the pioneers of creating new things, I mean, new aspects in drama. And this man, John Dryden, was much influenced by the French classics, and he tried to create a new era in literary discourse in English literature, in England particularly. From the regular neoclassical era began from John Dryden, and it continued up to Dr. Johnson. And John Dryden began the regular era of the neoclassicism. In last lecture, we have seen Philip Sidney and Philip Sidney's contribution and Ben Jonson's contribution to English criticism. Though they have contributed well, they have contributed much to uh, uh, the initial stages of English criticism. They were not regular critics. Whereas John Dryden, he performed as a regular critic. Other than his essay of dramatic poesy, Dryden had no formal treatise on criticism. All his prefaces in which he had written for various works, they explain the most important critical elements. Dryden's criticism is scattered through the prefaces that he had written. For example, the Apology for Heroic Poetry, there is a preface which talks about the superiority of epic over tragedy. And I have mentioned one point in the final slide for John Dryden. It goes like, Dryden echoed Aristotle. Dryden duplicated Aristotle. But in few factors, Dryden stood opposite to Aristotle's ideas. One is talking about the supremacy of epic over tragedy. When we studied, when we uh, talked about Aristotle, he laid tragedy a higher standard than epic in comparison. Accepting all the values of Aristotle, Dryden makes a different standard in comparison, comparing epic and tragedy. And the preface to the Fables, right, which appeared to the translations of tales from Homer, Ovid, and Chaucer, and that gave us the important aspects, or like the teachings of Dryden for the satirist. And he tried to give a new turn to English criticism. He the beauty of Dryden is he tried to combine the merits of both native tradition as well as the classical standards. So, in all the ways, he accepts Aristotle's definition in terms of poetry as the process of imitation, and he has no further statement to, excuse me. Yes, I'm sorry for it. Dryden accepts Aristotle's definition of poetry, like calling it as a process of imitation, and he also accepts what Aristotle makes a laying statement like poetry imitates what was, or what is said to be, and it is all a general accepted view of poetry. And Dryden tried to take the pain to emphasize the other two forms of definition, right, mentioned in Aristotle's definition. In his The Grounds of Criticism in Tragedy, and he talks about that imitation. And he also makes a statement like, as truth is the end of all speculations, so the discovery of it is the pleasure of them. That the truth is what the poetry tries to explain. In a way, when Aristotle makes a statement like poetry is a process of imitation, and he objected Plato's idea, where Plato's concept was poetry is a product of inspiration. So Aristotle called poetry as a product of imitation by explaining it, or his explanation statement is like, there is a natural pleasure in identifying the imitation, or from where it is imitated. That is what Dryden also tried to explain. When Dryden talked about the function of poetry, he says that delight is the chief end of poetry, and instruction can be admitted, but it is in the second place. So here Dryden goes with Plato as well as Aristotle, because Plato explained that poetry should instruct, and Aristotle said like poetry should delight. And Dryden did not stop with Plato and Aristotle. He moved a little further to the next generation of classics, to Horace, where Horace said like poetry should do both. And he also moved a little forward till Longinus' age, where Longinus said poetry should transport. Accepting all these experiences, accepting all these values, Dryden has his own words to explain that, like, poetry's function is delighting. Delight is the chief end of poetry. An instruction can be admitted, but it is in the second place, because poetry only instructs as it delights. The instruction can be properly transported to the audience mind only through delight. If there is no delight, there cannot be an instruction. Imagine Paradise Lost without any poetical elements, without any delightful experience. Or you can take any poem, you can take any forms of art, not in terms of poetry, you can take any forms of art. If we remove the aesthetics, what is remaining is just instruction. So that instruction cannot be taken forward to the audience mind if there is no delight. And poet is neither a teacher nor an imitator. He goes like a photographer, right? He is like a creator. He creates life with nature. He creates life or nature with his raw material and produces a new thing altogether. Say, for example, if you can take any love poem, imagine a poet compares his lady love with a rose, a plant, or moon. See, there are raw materials, and what the poet does here is he combines both and produces a new element, a new thing that resembles the original, but it is different from the original, and he calls it as the superstructure. So Dryden makes a new statement that it is a superstructure, and that is what the work of art. So here he gives reply to Plato, telling it like, when a poet becomes a creator and he mixes the raw material with the life or nature and creates a new thing altogether resembling the original but in different form, it is not a copy of a copy, it itself a new thing. So hope you remember Plato's theory of ideas. See, in each statement, in each point, Dryden tried to give answers to the classics. In a way, he tries to explain a new form to English criticism. He would like to introduce a new form to English criticism. And in terms of drama, Dryden mostly acclaimed the French classics. He introduced the French classics to Europe, I mean the entire Europe, especially to the English dramatist. Though there were greatest dramatists available, uh, maybe uh, in the older generation of Dryden, and he considered them inferior. In comparison, he considered the English stage inferior to French. We can mark the greatest Elizabethans, right, including Shakespeare or Ben Jonson. There are Marlowe. There are so many Elizabethans who ruled the English stage and who had the entire English audience in their control. But Dryden considered all of them as inferior to French stage, because in his essay of dramatic poesy, and he acknowledges the greatest contribution given by the French dramatist to the European stage, especially Neander. And in his essay of dramatic poesy, he defines a play as a just and lively image of human nature, representing its passions and humors and the changes of fortune to which it is subject, for the delight and instruction of mankind. And this statement is a very new approach to entire English critics or entire English audience, right? And he makes this purpose as well served by English drama, by the classical and especially the French. And when in terms of the mixture of tragic and comic, like tragic comedy, he is against it. He takes 2 or 3 steps again, away from the mixture of tragedy and comedy, because he considered that tragedy has its own reason, or tragedy has its own existential reason, right? And that should be properly conveyed to the audience. So similarly comedy, so when tragedy and comedy mixes together, audience will have a kind of mindset when they enter into a stage, or when they uh, spectate the first scene. Imagine if the character is suffering, if the hero is suffering on stage, audience will have a mind like, anyhow at the end, the final scene, the character will get the virtue, or his virtue will be rewarded. So that kind of preconceived notions are produced in tragic comedy, and that is not the real purpose of tragedy or comedy. So that is why he rejected that. And regarding unities, Dryden has a different approach towards the unities. Though he followed Aristotle in many ways, and he had a difference of opinion in terms of unities. And he considers, like, maybe his forerunners, like all the French dramatists, they did not follow the unities, all three unities of time, unities of place, unities of action together, right? And they made lots of excuses in following the unities, especially in terms of French dramas. So, following that, he says that unities are important and unities are accepted interpretations. And in terms of plot, it should be single, and time of action, it cannot be compiled into a 24 hours, and place, it can be varied, right? And he was the first one to declare unofficially the willing suspension of disbelief. Right? Maybe we'll study that later. When we go into romantics, and he accepted the unity of action, but in terms of unity of time and place, he had difference of opinion. He says that there can be many beautiful accidents or incidents, right, which might naturally happen in 2 or 3 days, right, which cannot arrive with any probability in the compass of 24 hours. So if an action of 24 hours, if that is the case, and it can be represented on stage in only without materially affecting the unity of time. So the plot can be increased a little more, right, to allow for a greater maturity of the plot. So when uh, when when a characters or actions are taken from two different time span, right, it can attract the audience, or it can deliver the proper the, the proper content to the audience. So in terms of unity of time, he is against it. It can be violated. That is what his idea is. Then in terms of unity of place, if he says that if the audience can imagine a stage to be a garden in the first act, why can't he imagine the same stage as a camp? Or why can't the audience imagine the same stage as a war field, or a palace, right? So it is not rules, but the time taken by the events, or it can be determined by the dramatist, right? He can determine or he can decide the stage, right? He can decide the setting, and it can be varied, right? And Ben Jonson or Sydney, they have no words to say about this unities because they were not regular critics. Dryden being a regular critic, Dryden being a scholar of the French classics as well as the Greek classics, and he had his own words to explain why the unity of time and why the unity of place can be violated. And finally he says that there is no absolute necessity for following the unities, right? There is no such absolute necessity. The time of a stage action should be strictly be confined to 24 hours. It has never to exceed them, right? Aristotle contends it because his Grecian stage was different. It was practiced in many different ways. But when time changes, when there are new ideas are interpreted, or new ideas are implemented on stage, these kind of violations can be accepted. And after that, when he talks about this tragedy, Dryden considers tragedy inferior to epic. And he defines tragedy as like Aristotle. He calls it as an imitation of one entire, great, and probable action, not told but represented. When that entire and great probable action is represented, it becomes tragedy. And what happens in tragedy is it moves us fear and pity, and it makes us into the purgation. And his definition of tragedy is absolutely of Aristotle's. And he calls it like tragedy becomes a conducive to the purging of those two emotions in our minds, that is fear and pity. He also follows the French critics, especially Rapin, in explaining that purgation or catharsis, because Rapin's explanation is different in French. He says that the pride and want of commiseration are the most predominant vices of mankind. So therefore, to cure of these two, the tragedy makers, the inventors of tragedy, they have chosen to work upon the two other passions, which are fear and pity. What are fear and pity doing there? Is pity is to cure pride, right? Pity is to cure pride, and uh, and the pity want of commiseration or hardness of heart. So this is bluntly didactic function than in Aristotle's intention, but Dryden makes his meaning clearer in his Tragedies of Last Age Considered. Is one of the one of the prefaces written, and he makes this statement. The punishment of vice and reward of virtue are most adequate ends of tragedy. So, whatever the tragedy's definition may, the end of tragedy is punishment of vice and reward of virtue. So, any kind of action can happen, but at the end, the punishment of vice and reward of virtue should be the end of tragedy. And while describing tragic hero, he says the tragic hero must be one who is capable of exciting that pity and fear, because the pity and fear are the core element of tragedy, and that pity and fear are going to uh, 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 going to do this final end of tragedy, that is punishment of vice and reward of virtue. So to give that proper end to tragedy, the tragic hero must be a capable person of exciting pity and fear. By looking at the character, the audience should get the pity and fear transported to his mind. And Dryden had no consideration for the group of characters called chorus. In Greek tragedy, there is no element of chorus, and he proved it is an unprofitable encumbrance on English stage. So having choruses, Dryden considers that it should be it could be a disturbance to the proper move of plot. Right, in Elizabethan and Jacobean plays, we have these violation of classical rules, but Dryden rejected chorus. Then, when he talks about comedy, Dryden calls it as a representation of human life in inferior persons and low subjects. So, comedy is made, the purpose of comedy is to make people laugh, right? But provided it should be for good behavior. So in comedy, what is Plato believed in classics was it should be it should be malicious, or that is testified by laughter. And here he makes a question, or the difference between tragedy and difference between comedy and farce. You know, when Dryden defines the when Dryden tries to explain the difference between comedy and farce, he calls comedy as a representation of human life in inferior persons and low subjects. When he talks about farce, he calls it as a kind of worse pleasure taken in at the eyes of the vulgar gazes. So he rejected the farce element, but he accepted the comedy. And in terms of the end of comedy, the final end of comedy is the first end of comedy is delight, and instruction is secondary. Whereas in tragedy, the first end of tragedy is instruction, and the tragic flaw can follow it. Whereas in comedy, the primary purpose of comedy is to make people laugh into good behavior. The first end of comedy is delight, and instruction takes only the second place. He also makes statements for wit. He calls it as a great thought dressed in words, so commonly received that it is understood by the meanest apprehensions. And he calls it as refined laughter. Wit makes a refined laughter. Wit produces the refined laughter, right? And he wanted the entire comedy to be witful. Comedy should consist of wits, and he wanted the English comedy to be more refined than it was in earlier stage. You know, when Ben Jonson, when he was the master of comedies in the last age, but he considered Ben Jonson inferior to French comedians, especially the comic makers. So he wanted the English comedies to be more refined than it was in the previous age. For that, what he instructs here is the English dramatists who make comedies, they should try to provide more wits. They should try to include more wits in their comedy. So he wanted comedy should be a refined laughter like wit. Then when he talks about the epic, as I mentioned earlier, epic here Dryden considers epic is superior than tragedy, and he just not only gives the valid points for epic, or not just stops with praising epic. What Dryden makes here is he tries to explain, or he tries to give answers, solutions to the problems or questions created by Aristotle. When Aristotle defined tragedy, he considers tragedy is superior than epic. Here, Dryden stands opposite to Aristotle's ideas. So he urges 3 points. He follows French critics and he urges 3 points in denying that epic is superior. Sorry, tragedy is superior to epic. First is he says that it is the actor's work as much as the poet's or the dramatist's work, and so the poet or dramatist alone cannot deserve the credit for it. Right? If a tragedy is successful, if tragedy is successfully celebrated, successfully received, it is not the whole work of the poet or the tragic writer. The equal credit goes to the actor. If the actor does not perform well, there is no chance for uh, deliverance, right? The content delivery. And second point is the stage is handicapped to show many things. Like in stage, a dramatist cannot show a big army. Nowadays it is possible. We have movers, right? We have 3D and 4D effects, and we can make any kind of sceneries, right? Any kind of scenes possible on screen. Whereas in stage, it is absolutely handicapped to show many things, like armies, right? For instances, and but whereas in epic, an epic writer make any number of lines to describe the situation, right? He can make use of any number of pages to describe the instance, right? He can describe the big armies, he can describe the beauty of the garden, right? He can dedicate 100 lines for each of the leaves available on tree, but it is not possible in tragedy. Number 3, many beauties are missed in tragedy as they are enough as there are enough available in epic. What happens in tragedy is, in epic, it beautifully renders in words, right? While we have leisure to digest what we read in the epic, we miss many beauties of play in the performance. Say, for example, when you read a work of art, when you read an epic, you have enough time to relish each line. You can rethink, you can imagine, you can spend enough time to relish. You can spend enough time to experience the experiences shared by the writer. Whereas in tragedy, you will have to move with the pace of the actors' dialogue delivery. You should move with the pace of the change of scenes, right? So there are many things are missed in tragedy. So with these three points, right, Dryden tried to urge that epic stands superior, right, than any other works of art. And even a play, a worthless play, if it is well acted, it may succeed in the theater, right? For example, we have so many movies in all languages, right, in which there is no space for right content, no space for right dialogue, but if it is well acted, if it is well presented, when in screenplays there are so many movies which got successful in theaters. Similarly, in terms of tragedy, even the worthless play, even the very unworthy contentful plays, if it is well acted, it can easily succeed in theater. So in many ways, tragedy stands lower, right, to epic. So Dryden finally therefore concludes that the heroic poem, that is epic, is certainly the greatest work of human nature. And the heroic poem, especially the epic, requires more gifted poet to write it than to write it the I mean than to write tragedy. Any dramatist can make tragedy. It is possible, it is easy. Any writer can bring tragic flaw in his writing. Any tragic maker with his actors, with the skill of their actors, can bring the tragic flaw transported from the actors or from the stage to the audience mind. But for this heroic poem, that is epic, it requires a more gifted poet. It is not easy to make an epic, right? Which is the reason why there have been so few epic poets in the world, right? So in English, we have only one epic, right? Paradise Lost. Okay, so tragedy is the miniature of human life, whereas epic poem is the draught at length, right? Okay, so here in terms of end of epic, for the moral is the first business of a poet. So that should be the groundwork of his poetry. So that should, as being the groundwork of the instruction, moral should be the first business of a poet. So all these statements he makes it for epic. Talks about criticism, or when he talks about satire before that, he says satire follows the epic standards. So the beauties of epics are partially available in satire. The satirist should choose one vice or one folly for his target, because it is not an epic poem. It cannot be a long narrative. There is a limit for satire. So what he makes here is, I mean, what kind of instruction he gives to the satirist here is, the satirist should choose one vice or one folly for his target. So that will be the extraordinary element that he can make it. And in terms of criticism, Dryden thought of the business of criticism is marked by the temper of his pronouncements. So, in spite of paying respect to the classical rules laid by Sidney and Ben Jonson, and he considered that rules are very important, but it is not that like Ben Jonson in last session we saw that rules are very important, but it should not dominate a writer. A writer should not purely depend on the rules. He accepts that point and he says that the business of a critic is not find petty faults, but to discover the great beauties that make it immortal. So this statement is further developed by the later critic in English, T.S. Eliot, who calls it like elucidation is a critic's work. It is not a judgment. Criticism is not judgment. This primary statement is involuntary or indirectly pioneered by John Dryden. So he makes a plain statement for critics like the business of a critic is not finding petty faults in work of art. A critic is not a judge. A critic has no work of judgment. But what a critic should do is he should discover the greatest beauties available in the work of art and explain it further so that the work of art becomes immortal. So these statements he makes it for criticism, right? And in terms of rules, he makes it like for without rules there cannot be art. So any more than there can be a house without a door, it is like, right? A house uh, cannot sustain without this door, right? So similarly, art, there should be rules, but it should be a happy genius. In the sense, it should not overrule. The rule should not overrule. A critic or an artist should not purely depend on the rules. It can be either classical rules or any favorable rules created by the contemporaries or the ancestors. Okay. Finally, Dr. Johnson considered Dryden as the father of English criticism because he was the first writer who first taught the English to determine the principles of merits of composition. No English critics before Dryden or no other writers before Dryden English tried to do that, try to create or try to determine the principles of the merits of composition. Dryden was the first one to touch that. So Dryden begins the regular era of English criticism. So we call it like Dryden is the true pioneer of neoclassicism in English. So with all these respects, we move on to the next numerous critic, Joseph Addison. Now, as I told you in the introduction, Joseph Addison, most or all the works, all the critical ideas are explained through papers, critical papers in his Spectators. I have given a small or a brief uh, introduction to the Spectator magazine. It ran for just 1.5 years in from 1711 to 1712, not even the whole 2 years. There are around 555 numbers of letters available, and those 555 numbers were collected into 7 volumes. Most of the numbers are contributed by Joseph Addison, and a set of letters are contributed by Richard Steele. And in 1714, it appeared thrice weekly for 6 months. That was completely run by Richard Steele. And when we talk about Joseph Addison, it is an undeniable statement like Joseph Addison was the first scholar in English who brought the philosophy out of closets to the clubs, at tea tables, and in coffee houses. And he brought the philosophy to common men. he introduced the philosophical ideas to the common men. Common men started talking about philosophies. Common men they started talking about the works of art, the merits of works of art, the positive and merits and demerits of a work of art. All these became possible only because of Joseph Addison's contribution. And he had a concern for reader. This is very true and undeniable factor about Joseph Addison. Unlike the other writers, you can take from Plato till John Dryden, they all concerned about writers. They all instructed to the writers. Joseph Addison was the first critic ever in all literature, all literary forums, who considers the reader. And he taught the reader what to be chosen, what to be read, what to be avoided, and what is the true merit of a work of art in term or in perspective of a reader. All these factors are explained by Joseph Addison. And in the beginning, in one of the essays in his Spectators, he talks about wit, and he calls it true wit and false wit. So, as we have seen Dryden, he defined wit as a thing well said, or a thing, a thought dressed in words. That's how Dryden defined wit, right? And he makes it like Addison defines wit, uh, not of wit, but of good writing in general. And for that he borrows Locke's definition of wit in his essay concerning human understanding. He calls wit as the truth, or something nearer to truth, as the assemblage of ideas wherein can be found any resemblance or congruity to make up pleasant pictures and agreeable visions. Maybe you can think like fancy, right, which later Coleridge defined. So that is, the combining similar ideas to suggest a new idea to the mind is called wit. You can take any poetry. So what wit presents here is, wit gives delight and surprise to the reader. And these two properties, that is delight and surprise, become very essential to wit. Wit cannot survive without this delight and surprise. So as already said, combining similar ideas to suggest a new idea to the mankind is called wit. So while combining two similar ideas, or many number of similar ideas, in terms of suggesting a new idea to the mankind, what is produced is delight and surprise. Therefore, the resemblance in new ideas, or the resemblance of ideas in wit, where it is necessary that the ideas should not lie too near to one another. In the same time, the likeness is obvious. When it happens, it gives no surprise. And for that, he gives lots of examples. And he considers like false wit, anagrams, acrostics, or he considers as false wit. So hope you all know what is anagrams and acrostics. Anagrams, like anagram is a rearrangement of letters of a word or a phrase to form a new word or a new phrase. Like Augustus, the name Augustus is made of Gustavus, right? Or Florence Nightingale, that the term Florence Nightingale can be turned into flit on cheering angel, right? Both have same spelling. So this is what anagram is: rearrangement of letters in a word to make a new word, or to form a new word. And acrostic is commonly a poem in which sometimes the initial letters of all lines, or the middle letters of all lines, or the final letters of all lines will be alphabetically arranged, or some new word or some new passage is, not passage, some new phrase is made. So this type of resemblance, or this type of assemblage of ideas, are false wit according to uh, Joseph Addison. So what is true wit is pun, he calls as true wit. Right? For pun, he takes one example. Uh, 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 Addison gives this example, that is in As You Like It. I think in scene 3, sorry, act, just a minute. In act 3 and scene 2, uh, yeah, it happens when Celia, right, who describes Orlando as furnished like a hunter, what she tries to mean is he's dressed in the clothes and carries the equipment of a hunter. That is what she tries to mean. But Rosalind interprets Celia's words metaphorically. This is where Shakespeare shows his greatness. Rosalind interprets Celia's words in metaphorical manner, and Rosalind sees Orlando as coming to kill her heart. That is what his statement is. Oh, he comes to kill my heart. Heart here has another meaning, heart. Right? So this is what the playful use of language. So Rosalind's statement can also be seen as foreshadowing of their eventual romance. So just as a hunter sets out to capture a prey, and Rosalind here believes Orlando will capture her heart. So in metaphorical sense, and this is what pun is, right? And in Abraham Cowley's poem, there is another example we can see, and we call them as mixed wit, right? And Addison makes a statement, mixed wit. In Abraham Cowley's Love's Riddle, there is one phrase like burning glasses made of ice. So it cannot happen, right? It is a paradoxical nature. But here it is possible because it is poet statement, and burning glass, right? And there are combining these two, burning glass and ice. Cowley creates a powerful image, right, as of love's complexity. So it is a force that can be both destructive and life giving. So both intensely pleasurable and deeply painful. That is what the burning glass is made of ice. So it is some metaphorical ideas. So love can be both passionate and cold, and love can be a source of pleasure and pain. So ultimately, what Cowley tries to mean here is love is a paradox. So it is something that we cannot fully understand, right? And similarly, there are other paradoxical examples available in literature. In Romeo and Juliet, you can see one phrase like a sea of fire, right? A sea of fire, again the same. Or in the metaphysical poet John Donne's The Ecstasy, in the poem Ecstasy, we can see one phrase like a fairy eyes, right? Or similarly in another play Hamlet, a rose without a thorn, right? Shakespeare's statement, rose without a thorn, right? And this statement is a metaphorical statement made used by Gertrude, right, who was the queen of Denmark, right? And I think it appears in Hamlet Act 1 and Scene 3. Gertrude had a conversation with Claudius where she says a rose without a thorn, right? What she tries to mean here is she is essentially saying that something perfect and beautiful is possible. She's expressing her hope for a happy and peaceful future with Claudius, despite the tragic events that have recently occurred in her life, and she expects something happier and peaceful future, right? Peaceful kind of future. It is an ironical explanation, and this is what Dryden calls it as mixed wit. Then he talks about taste for this wit or witful ideas. To understand all this kind of witful ideas, a man should be a man of taste, right? A reader should be a man of taste. A mental taste is needed to accept or to understand all these ideas. So he says mental taste, which we apply to literary products, is ultimately of the same kind as the taste of a palate that distinguishes flavor from flavor. When we eat something, when we taste a sweet, we understand that it is sweet, and in next minute when we eat something which is hot, we feel it. So that is distinguished, the flavor is distinguished by our taste of palate. Similarly, a man needs a mental taste that should be applied with literary products to understand the same kind. And this is possible, right? To know whether one possesses this type of mental taste, Addison makes a statement like, we would have read over the celebrated works of antiquity. If a reader continuously approaches to the celebrated works of antiquity, the old works, the classics, which have stood the test of so many different ages and countries, or the works among the moderns which have the sanction of the politer part of our contemporaries, one can become a man of taste. So a man of taste is made by repeated approach to works of art. So this is a faculty, this is a skill, right? Is in some degree the gift of nature. For some people, it is acquired naturally. Sorry, it is received naturally. They are naturally gifted, as we have seen in Sydney's statement. People are naturally gifted, and this natural gift can also be acquired, right? Any man can become a man of taste, and what he has to do is he should approach to the celebrated works of antiquity, or he should be approaching toward the different ages and countries, right, which among the moderns sanction the polluted parts of the contemporaries. And when he talks about the imagination, the pleasure of imagination, he makes further statements like, imagination was another misunderstood term, right? Especially in Addison's time, Addison's contemporary. In a few papers in Spectator, he wrote those papers to clarify the meaning of imagination. He explains how art and literature makes a powerful appeal to the imagination. But the meaning he assigns here to the term is limited one. He makes it dependent on the sense of sight. Like he says, like it is this sense which furnishes the imagination with its ideas, so that by the pleasures of imagination or fancy, here he means like which is aroused from the visible objects, right? Or like paintings, statues, descriptions, or any other occasions. What it creates in our mind is imagination. So when we are imagining something, we get the natural pleasure. So the pleasure of imagination becomes into two parts. Here Addison makes this. Addison makes two kinds of imagination. One is primary imagination and secondary imagination. The same statement Coleridge makes in Romantic era, but what Coleridge discusses about imagination is different from Addison's discussion of imagination. So here in Addison's discussion, imagination can be of two kinds. One is primary imagination and secondary imagination. Primary imagination is entirely proceeded from objects which are seen by our eyes, what we see. Say for example, when you are listening to this lecture, if you look at your garden through window, you could see a beautiful flower. What you see is a flower. So you would imagine something, and that is primary imagination. Here, the secondary imagination is the ideas of visible objects when the objects are not actually before our eyes. So when I talked about a beautiful flower, one would have, there are around 62 people here. One would imagine a rose, one would have imagined a lotus, one would have imagined a jasmine flower. So it depends on people's ideas, right? So this is what secondary imagination is. Secondary imagination is something from the ideas of visible objects when the objects are not actually before our eyes. So but they are called up into our memories, or they are formed into an agreeable visions. Say for example, when I talk about New York, if I have not visited New York, I would have described you New York from the points that I have gathered through my reading or through my visions over television or some visible objects. If you have not visited New York, when I talk about New York, you would imagine imaginary New York in your mind. Am I right? So this is what secondary imagination is. So what Addison here has a point to discuss, to explain about imagination is, only the secondary imagination gives pleasure. Primary imagination gives pleasure, but that is temporary. The greatest pleasure in imagination arises in secondary imagination. So the arts like painting, sculpture, they reproduce objects, they reproduce objects to suggest their ideas, and pleasure arises from a comparison of a copy with the original. But in secondary imagination, the pleasure itself is original. So, words well chosen have a great force in that. So, imagination is no more than the faculty of mind, which enjoys the work of art for the ideas that they recall of what it has seen in life. So, it is pleased more by what is great, strange, or beautiful, like mountains, right, or nature, lovely sights, everything. So, in recognition of that imagination, we get an aesthetic pleasure, and that aesthetic approach to literature is what the real enjoyment. That is what Addison tries to explain in Pleasure of Imagination. When he talks about tragedy, and he has nothing of his own to talk about tragedy, he borrowed everything from Aristotle, Horace, right, Horace or other French neoclassicists, especially Rapin. So, as Aristotle said, tragedy is the noblest product of mankind. He accepts that. And in terms of tragic hero, a tragic hero must be a virtuous man struggling with misfortune. He accepted that. And he talks about plots. Plot, not just plot, he talks about double plot, underplot, and the coverage. And he considers that the underplot makes a weak play. Sorry, double plot makes a weak play. Whereas for underplot, he has no objection because he says underplot is an undeniable factor with the main plot. Whereas in double plot, that may deviate the audience understanding. And in terms of showing, I mean, action, he considers that violence can be better told, not acted, right? So there is another historical explanation available that in Addison's time, when the violence is much, I mean, not much overjoyed, he considers that violence is better reported than acted, and he considers the most suitable form for tragedy is blank verse, because in blank verse, uh, a tragic maker has the liberty of explaining his ideas. Then he talks about Milton's greatness, especially in Paradise Lost. He considers that Milton fulfilled Aristotle's requirement of epic. He followed all the requirement laid by Aristotle in Paradise Lost, especially because it is single and it is complete and great. It is single in plot, it is complete in action, it is great in style, and the expression is sublime. Expression in Milton's Paradise Lost is sublime, great, noble, and he compares Milton's Paradise Lost with Homer's epics and Virgil's epic in Latin. And finally, when we talk about Addison's contribution to criticism, and he I mean, he wanted the literary craft should not be a mere matter of rules, and something more than that is required. So, a criticism should not be a slavish application of rules, but the rules of classics are also important. And so, he wanted something more than rules is needed for English criticism. As Addison is not a regular critic like John Dryden, he had not laid any an exclusive set of rules for English critics, but he wanted to suggest the English critics to prepare or to think of what is actually needed for English criticism. And here Addison's ideas are partly neoclassical and partly artistic, because he wanted to justify, or he wanted to justify, I mean, especially justify his factors to the spectators, the essays that he writes for Spectator. Uh, and in maybe in our next lecture, I'll talk more about Addison's contribution to English criticism, or what kind of instruction he wanted to make for English criticism. Because when we talk about Pope, Alexander Pope and Dr. Johnson, who are going to be the threshold, or who are going to be the very crucial figures, right, who mark the twilight of the neoclassical era, because Dr. Johnson ended the neoclassical era and he laid a bridge, right, a bridge, or a force for romantics, right? Both Alexander Pope and Dr. Johnson were brilliant. And while we talk about Alexander Pope and Dr. Johnson, we would also see some of the wonderful factors about Addison's instruction to the critics. Especially Pope and Dr. Johnson's approaches, they challenged the established norms of the so-called English neoclassical criticism, and they paved way for new literary movements, right? Particularly the Romantics. So I hope I have done justice to this lecture. If you have any clarifications or doubt, you can raise. Okay, then thank you so much for listening. Um, Maybe in our next lecture, we would see Alexander Pope's and Dr. Johnson's contribution to English criticism, especially the neoclassicism in English. And after that, we'll move on to the Romantics.
For your wonderful session, and we hope we don't have any queries from the participants. If you have any queries, please do express it in the chat box, and that's the feedback form which is also been put in there.